Debate, and I call firstly Jenni Minto, who will be followed by Murdo Fraser for around 4 minutes, please, Ms Minto.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I attended the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee as a substitute for its meeting on the 11th of January 2022, so unlike Mr Simpson, I wasn't steeped in the history of that committee. This was the final evidence session of the committee's inquiry into the use of the made affirmative procedure during the coronavirus pandemic, and evidence was being taken from the Deputy First Minister, as he has stated, so I had no pressure that day at all. Reading the evidence already provided by the two earlier sessions, there was much agreement from all of the witnesses on the key areas of questioning: clarity and accessibility of law, how to define urgency, and scrutiny of the executive by Parliament. I'll look at each of these separately but briefly. I have the ability to do so from two different points of view: firstly, as a parliamentarian, and secondly, in my previous life as a community activist, when we were looking for up-to-date and clear guidance set out in a way that was easy to understand and to pass on to those who we were supporting during the COVID pandemic. The law should be clear and accessible to all, especially where the law is continually changing and sometimes coming into force with immediate effect, as has been the case during this pandemic. And Sir Jonathan Jones said, ironically, it's probably true to say that it is easier to legislate for a lockdown with very tight controls and only minimal exceptions by drafting very tight and clear laws than it is to legislate, as we saw later in the pandemic, for partial closures and multiple exceptions. Now, from my own experience during lockdown and the emergence of it, I recognise this analysis. Throughout the pandemic, individuals, businesses and communities were looking for clear guidance and timely guidance as to what they should or should not be doing. Emerging from the lockdown was difficult. The resilience group I was part of discussed this long and hard as to how we achieved it safely on Isla. The Scottish Government's route map provided the blueprint for our work. To ensure that the laws are clearly understandable to everyone affected, the DPLR committee has concluded that policy notes and explanatory notes be written in plain English and in sufficient detail. Defining urgency was seen as key in determining the use of the made affirmative procedure. In her evidence, Morag Ross QC suggested that it would be tempting to think that we could narrow that down to say that urgency definitely means X or Y and that it doesn't mean Z, A, B or C. She went on to say, also things change, so there must be flexibility to allow decisions to be made that respond to changing circumstances. Urgency might mean one thing in 1 week and something else in week 2, so you have to allow for responses to be developed. Now, the example that the Deputy First Minister has just given in his speech actually talked about 48 hours. And he concluded in his evidence by saying, in my book, that is why urgent action is required, because the situation has changed before our eyes in a very dramatic order and fashion. In its conclusions, as others have said, the committee has asked for transparency as to the criteria for determining a situation is suitably urgent to merit the use of a made affirmative procedure, by requesting a written statement of justification and evidence prior to the instrument coming into force, and to ensure that any such regulations are published as quickly as possible. All witnesses raised concerns about the increased use of the made affirmative procedure during the coronavirus pandemic and how this has impacted on Parliament's scrutinising or holding the executive to account. Professor Tierney commented, "From my work in scrutinising legislation over many years, I have come to realise that all governments like powers. They like to get more of them." In answering my question on what the Scottish Government has learnt from the pandemic and how this could shape future decision-making and the use of made affirmative procedures to allow proper parliamentary scrutiny, the Deputy First Minister said, "In the circumstances of a global pandemic, that requires swift action. The measures that have been taken are appropriate. However, we should always be open to learning lessons from the situation, and the Government will consider with care any output from the committee's inquiry." Presiding Officer, the DPLR report and its conclusions provide a number of suggestions as to how the decisions around the made affirmative procedure could be enhanced. I hope the Scottish Government does consider its findings with care.
Thank you very much, Ms Minto.